It's my great pleasure to introduce to you my friend Nahomi Ichino. She's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Michigan. She received her PhD from Stanford in 2008. Before her appointment in Michigan, she worked as a professor of government at Harvard for 5 years. She's a very distinguished scholar of political science. She's published in all of the leading journals in our discipline, including British Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, American Journal of Political Science, and APSR, so a clean sweep of the big four, multiple times in AJPS. She's a recognized expert on the democratic politics of Africa with a country specialization in Ghana. And she's also a leading specialist on comparative political methodology, including qualitative methods, quantitative methods, and experimental methods. Again, the troika together. And really impressively to my mind, and very usefully for those of us who are fellow travelers, she integrates these multiple methods in very helpful ways, drawing on the strengths of each methodology. We are very fortunate to have her. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nahomi Ichino.
I'm quite a bit shorter than Dan, so thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited to be able to share some of my work with my colleague, Noah Nathan, today. We have a student who's a BYU grad in our graduate program who's fabulous, and we're very excited that we're able to share this work with you. So today, as part of the series on women in politics, I'd like to focus more on the aspects of our research on political parties and elections in Africa that affect the representation of women. Okay, excellent. So when you think about women in Africa, you probably actually in this room think of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, but for representation of women in Africa, the place that most people think about most immediately is Rwanda. Rwanda today has President Paul Kagame, who has been a big supporter of women, and the parliament in Rwanda has about 2/3 women. It is impressive. It is the highest number of women, highest share of women in any legislature around the world, but it is part of a non-democratic regime. And many other parliaments that have great representation of women are actually not very democratic regimes. You can also think of Uganda, for example. They have seats that are reserved for women, a big push to get women elected, also not particularly democratic country. So, so is it hard to get women elected in new democracies? Is democracy the thing that makes it hard to get women elected? You can think about, the top places that have women represented in the legislature. This is from the Interparliamentary Union. And the top there is Rwanda, then followed by Cuba, Bolivia, Mexico. We've got Sweden leading the Nordic countries. And then a couple other African countries in the top 11. I wanted to include Senegal, so it's not the top 10. But it includes Namibia and South Africa and Senegal. Senegal is a pretty decent democracy, so South Africa. But representation of women drops off pretty quickly after this top group. Ghana, which is the country that I focus on, is 146th. Here we go. Right below Syria. And not doing, a whole lot better than Hungary, for example, but mixed in with a whole bunch of countries that are democratic, undemocratic. So one of these questions is, Ghana, relative to a lot of African countries, is considered to have a pretty strong democracy. Its cultural background is, very diverse, relatively traditional, but compared to a lot of other parts of Africa, a place where women are considered to have pretty good social standing. There are various ethnic groups that are matrilineal, where people trace their descent through the mother's line, and mothers and female relatives through the mother's line are held in great regard, traditional roles that place a lot of emphasis on the role of women. But in Ghana, women's representation isn't particularly high. So why so few women? There's a lot of scholarship on this, as well as a lot of pop discussion about why this might be. And people think about the underrepresentation of women as being a really big problem, and generally because we think of generally protecting women as relating to protecting children, thinking about women's contribution to society for the economy or just their human fulfillment as important goals. And so there's a lot of discussion about this in Ghana. Just to take one person, because he happened to give a press interview about this, Honorable Hayford, who is an MP from a particular constituency for one particular party, he gave an interview and gave a bunch of reasons. So the first, which I think many people would agree, is that the men set the rules of engagement, define the standards of evaluation that discourage women. They say, you put women up there, and the men decide whether they're qualified or not, and they're very harsh towards women. Another reason he gives is that the parties aren't particularly supportive of women, that the parties in general don't support candidates very much. They expect the candidates to finance the campaigns themselves. And women are just not as connected to political networks as men. Another reason he gives is the electoral system. Ghana, like the United States, has single-member districts, meaning in any particular district, only one person is elected. So you could compare it to many European countries that have proportional representation. So if one party gets 30%, another party gets 30%, those parties can basically decide, with varying degrees, which people actually make up those 30%. And a lot of countries have zipper rules where that list has to alternate between men and women. It makes it much easier to actually get women into office compared with single-member districts. Separate from these institutional concerns, this MP has raised, and many people have raised, is that there's something about the women. They lack confidence. They might come from a society that discourages women for taking leadership roles. They don't have as much access to education. And there's just bias in society. Women should be in the home. Their role is to take care of family. And if you're out and about campaigning, you are a prostitute, is the name that's often given to them. And so he raises all of these issues as potentially explanations for why there are so few women. And the interview continues with, well, what should we do about it? And let's see. So, standard kinds of things. We should have capacity training for women, help them take leadership roles. We see these kinds of programs all the time. We think, let's see. We could be like Uganda and create seats that are just for women, and maybe that'll make it easier to get women represented, but that would require constitutional reform. And then he moves on to a couple ideas about what the parties can do. So one of these is to just create more opportunities for women to take on leadership roles, so people get used to seeing women up front. I guess like me today. So you get an idea that women might be up there and you might be like them, encouraging more women to run. And the final thing that he suggests is maybe the party should just put women in constituencies where they're probably going to win. So if, for example, if the Republicans wanted more women in Congress, they just say, here, this is a district that the Republicans always win, put a woman there as the candidate. If the Democrats really want a woman, pick a constituency where the Democrats are almost certainly going to win and put a woman there. The party could just intervene and put these people there. These are very tricky kinds of interventions, but they ask us to think about how political parties are actually organized, how they work, and how it interacts with the larger political system, which has competitive elections, and really crucially, patronage politics. So, what I'm going to argue today over the next so many minutes is that just in the larger context of the party politics, there are reforms that expanded the electorate ahead of the 2016 elections. The Ghanaian party went from having not that many people voting and having mostly men voting to much larger numbers of people voting and nearly a 50-50 split. And one of the consequences of this was a much more diverse aspirant pool, people who are seeking the nomination, as well as actually the people who are nominated, they're much more diverse in the end. We don't actually often get to see how much the question of who votes affects who's elected, because most parts of the world actually already have universal suffrage. Most new democracies, most developing countries, got universal suffrage at the same time that they became independent. As compared with, say, the United States, where women won the suffrage gradually, state by state, and so on, or parts of Europe where we end up with property requirements for voting changing, so the poor gradually got to vote. Most parts of the developing world, places that are new democracies today, we actually see everybody always gets to vote. So it's hard to know whether who gets to vote is making a big difference. The Ghana case actually gives us some hints that who votes makes a really big difference, and that gives us suggestions for how to think about how to get more women into office. Just in terms of the magnitude of the effect, we start out with about 1/3 of a woman per constituency running for office. So out of if you had 3 constituencies, on average, there's only 1 person running for office. And we get a 50% increase in the number of women running for office with this reform. In terms of nominees, there's 0.13 female nominees on average, right? So, you have 9 nominees, 1 is going to be a woman, and you actually get a 50% increase in that as well. So very, very low numbers up to, still low, but kind of quite significant increase. So how do I want to think about this? Okay, so just to step back for a little bit of background on Ghana. So Ghana, you may or may not know, is a small West African country. It's about 26 million people. It's lower middle income. So in terms of GDP per capita, it's between Vietnam and India, somewhere in that range. They're on the same election system as the United States. Every 4 years, there's 2 major political parties that are competing for office. And currently, unlike the United States, there's one legislative chamber, parliament, and there are 275 members elected from these single-member constituencies. And unlike the United States, we don't really have politics that you think of in this left-right dimension. Right? So today, when you listen to the news about what might be happening in primaries, who might be running, you hear progressive, really progressive, or right-wing, really far right-wing, centrist. You think about this in the spatial setting. In Ghana, in much of Africa, you don't want to think about politics that way. The main way in which politics happens is people come and make promises that your area is going to develop if you elect me. And I'm going to be better for you if you elect me. And that's quite literally promises of, I will build a school here, I will bring a road here, I will get the electricity company to bring electric lines here, I will build a well here, and so on. These are promises of development, and everybody's going around promising this. So the question is, who do you believe? How do you as a candidate make yourself believable and credible here? And that competition of I'm making the best promises to you in the most credible way is an election campaign. So in this context, what does a party leader do? Party leader has to make sure that the candidate they present in front of you to vote is somebody really attractive, right? A great candidate who is going to, make these promises, have you believe me, and then get the votes. But another problem here is that party leaders need to make sure that there's actually a party going out on behalf of those candidates to knock on doors, to say, I know that guy. He was really great 10 years ago when he helped out with this, and so you should vote for him. They need to have a whole army of people, basically, ready to go out and campaign for you. And those people need their compensation. So how is this managed? Kind of the solution that the parties have settled on is these small electorate primaries. So that's a small number of people voting for the primaries, and it's this terrible but kind of genius solution. So if I need you guys to go out and campaign for me, but I don't have the money to pay you to do that, and I can't get you motivated by what kind of policy we would put in if we got elected, but then what I need to do is figure out some other way to get you guys paid to go out on behalf of my candidate. I can have a primary and have a whole bunch of people compete for your votes and basically buy your votes. They compete over you, so you say, well, the other guy gave me $5. And then, this guy's like, oh, I'll give you 6 then. And then you can go back to the original guy and say, well, the other guy gave me 6, and so on. And so this kind of competition for your support, which is necessary in your primary, is one way of funding the party. And this, you can imagine, has lots of downsides, but it's a kind of a genius solution to this problem that the party leader would really like to make sure that there's a base of people who are willing to go out and go support the candidate. So, I said $5 and $6 and $7, but it's sometimes a motorcycle. It's sometimes a TV. It's, in a place where GDP per capita is between India and Vietnam, a campaign can cost tens of thousands of dollars. And, in this version, maybe only 2,000 or 3,000 voters in some cases. So some people are getting a lot of money, some people are getting not that much, but the competition is really serious, and a lot of it is bags of rice, T-shirts, and actual money. This has a couple downsides, as I mentioned. Widespread vote buying, which is not a good look. It is not good for democracy. It makes you look cheap. High, noble ideas about democracy is not what's going on here. It's also the case that everybody thinks, I paid a lot of money, how come I didn't win? And this leads to court cases and disputes. This is not great for the party. The other thing that happens is that the kinds of people who run for office end up being what one of the people we interviewed called money bags. So Noah and I did a bunch of interviews with people who ran for office, and they complain about the guys who have no community service record. And they just fly in with their money bags and go around paying everybody, and then they win the nomination. But then they get to the election, and guess what? They're not great campaigners. They're not very nice people. They look like money bags. So, this is a problem. This is not the kind of people. If I were a party leader, I'm happy to have their money, but I don't really want them running for office. So these, this has led to periodic discussions about what can be done to change this party system. Change this primary system. They would like to reduce the vote buying. It's basically crowding out people who might be great candidates who don't have money. And often that's going to be women who don't have the business connections, the political connections to have all this money. There's lots of discrimination against women. They just don't occupy the same kinds of business roles and other things that give them a lot of money. And the kinds of women who have been campaigning for you diligently on behalf of the party, who have been important leaders in the community, they're totally priced out. Right? So this is a problem for party leaders, and they keep having discussions about how can they rein this in, but they need the money. So in this context, here's an example where, for one constituency, here's a guy who thought, okay, I'm going to challenge the incumbent. He hasn't been doing a great job. And I'm going to think, my hometown's bigger than his hometown. I've been doing a great job in my hometown. I should win the primary. But the incumbent, who has access to a lot of money because people want to pay him bribes and other things, I don't know whether he was actually paid bribes, but that's just kind of the general system, probably paid a lot more money and ended up winning. So people have money can also defend their seats once they're in the system, which makes it actually even harder for women to break through. So thinking about this, I'm going to focus on the reform that's between 2012 and 2016. So the political parties, there are two political parties. There's the NDC and the NPP. The NDC was in power because the check mark means that they won the election. And both parties start out, in 1992, when Ghana becomes a democratic country, as parties where everything is controlled by the guy at the top. Parties are really undemocratic. They're just vehicles of the party leader. And there's back and forth going from the party leader choosing all the nominees to, well, maybe they should have a little bit of a primary, to actually that didn't work out so well, so we're going to have centralized control again, to maybe we should let this primary thing happen so that the money goes down to the party agents and so on, whereas the other party has sort of kind of stuck to a mostly centralized system. So even in these new democracies, parties aren't particularly democratic, but they are aware that this is not a good look for them. And so what happens is in between 2012 and 2016, one party changes its rules from just having a few people voting in a primary to significantly more people voting. And that significantly more people includes a lot more women. And the question is, what happens as a consequence of it? And you can see that the number of women elected, were up to that 13%-ish number at the end, started out kind of in the 5%, 10% range. It's just not been a particularly good record. So what is that reform? We go from 5 people per polling station. That's kind of the basic unit in party in Ghana, and to everybody who is associated with the party at that polling station. It's a big increase. These party leaders are like, the local secretary, the local branch leaders. And this means that we go from about, 200, 800 voters in a primary, which is small enough that you can do the vote buying thing, to a few thousand. And this means usually that five number includes one position known as a women's organizer, which is always a woman. None of the 4 other positions aren't restricted by gender, but they never really elect women to those positions. So we go from about 20% female to about gender parity in the party population. And then the other issue here is the marginalized groups. There's a lot of ethnic politics in Ghana, and the political party is associated with particular ethnic groups. And so some groups are just not that well represented in certain parties. So, you go from something that looks like a, really ethnically homogeneous leadership to a voting population that's much more diverse. So we get these two big changes. So our argument is that the reforms expand and diversify the electorate, expand and diversify the aspirant pool as a consequence. So the vote buying we expect to become really difficult. The vote buying used to involve, with those 200, 800 people, things like, I've already gotten you secured. You promised to vote for me. So the day before the primary, I will bring you to the place we're going to have the voting, put you up in a hotel, and lock you up, and not allow you to talk to other people. I suppose you could call people on cell phones and whatnot, but it would be pretty hard for cash to actually get transferred in like a really super large way. I guess you could do money transfers on your phone. But this kind of super dense monitoring of the people you paid and you secured, at the primary site is just not possible with 2,000, 8,000 people. So the other thing that we expect to happen is that this is more like a regular election when you have thousands and thousands of people. We have regular people living all over the place. And part of general feature of Ghanaian politics is that people vote based upon their identity. We expect a lot more of this general kind of identity-based voting. And as a consequence, we think that we should get more minorities getting representation because they're voting in the same way that they would in the general election. So previously discouraged aspirants from these marginalized groups, ethnic or women, could see themselves as being more viable because they see that the people who are going to be voting for them look like them. And in the general election, we've seen for ethnicity that makes a difference for the way people vote. For women, they might feel that they have a much better shot if there are more women voting. So this is just a super simple theory, right? The MPP, so only one party made this change, and the other party thought about it, but didn't actually do it. So what we're going to use is this other party as the contrast and control for the party that made the change. So, kind of a super simple hypothesis here, before we get kind of complicated and nerdy about political science, is, so an aspirant is somebody who, in the United States, sometimes we call them pre-candidates, somebody who says they're going to run for office, because they're going to seek the nomination. They might get persuaded to drop out later on, but everybody who declares we're going to count as an aspirant. And so we expect the reforms to increase number of people from the marginalized ethnic groups, as well as the number of women. Okay? Kind of unclear what should happen with the number of aspirants from the core ethnic groups. So maybe there are people who didn't have money, but feel like, they're still a good ethnic fit, so they're going to run more. And therefore, the total number of aspirants is just a function of the other components. So we'll see. We have unclear expectations for this. And then, these reforms are supposed to make it less likely that you end up with a money bag in our interviewees' terms. That was the goal. It's a little bit unclear whether that should happen. So with a regular kind of, you have to go out campaigning for 8,000 people, maybe your reputation is the thing that should matter a lot more. But that isn't to say that money can't help that along, right? So it's a little bit unclear whether this should actually cut down on the money bags. So how the setup, this is I'm not sure how interesting this will be for non-political scientists So I'm going to talk kind of generally about this. But the main issue here is that we'd really like to know what would have happened in the party that made the reforms if they hadn't made the reforms, right? Like, maybe there's kind of naturally an increase in the number of women who are running. Maybe there's naturally a decrease in the number of women who are running. We need to know what would have happened without the reforms. That's the thing we're really interested in. And, we're going to have to figure out kind of a way to guess at what that would be. So our setup is to treat this like an experiment, like use the language of experiments, though it wasn't an experiment. And so in this case, our treatment, the thing we want to know the effect of, is allowing rank and file members in a constituency vote in these primary elections. And this is that the National Party made this reform. That guy there was a picture of, he made this reform. It wasn't that different places chose to have different reforms. And the way, so one party ends up being the treated group, and the other party ends up being the control group because they had the same set of rules but didn't make any changes at all. So our unit is a party constituency, and our estimand, meaning the thing we're trying to get at, is the average effect of these reforms in the one party across all these constituencies. So, kind of a key thing for comparing these two, using one party as a control for the other, is, well, we expect the parties are really kind of evenly matched. The sizes of their kind of core base support are really, really close. The organizational structure is identical. The kind of dominance of local ethnic elites in particular constituencies is really pretty similar. And really, really crucially, they used the same rules for the primaries in the previous election, and only one party made a change. So, the MPP, the fact that the other party had considered the change but didn't adopt the rules is a big deal because it means that, they're facing the same problems. And it was a serious enough problem. And, so it's not like we're looking at completely different parties here. So, this is where, for those of you who are really into political science, we use a technique called optimal full matching, not necessary for today. And for our estimation, we use weighted least squares regression with effect of the treatment on the treated weighting. Again, not particularly important for today, but I'm really happy to take questions on it. For comparison, both for establishing the validity of the statistical technique and also just for comparison to the US, we don't get people saying, oh, I'm going to do better over here, so I'm going to choose to run over here. Or these are unfavorable places, so I'm not going to run there. You can't do that. And you can't decide that I'm going to pick a party to run in that's going to be more favorable to me. The rules are that you have to have been a party member for 4 years. It's kind of not really reasonable for you to run any place other than where you were born because everybody thinks you're a carpetbagger if you do anything else. So you're pretty much set for where you're going to be able to run. So people can't just choose to run in the place that, they can't choose to go to one party because they think they're going to do better in that party. And the other thing that happens is in the United States, you hear the discussion of the primaries now, among the Democrats, the question is who can beat the incumbent, President Trump, right? Among the, I haven't heard so much about who's going to be challenging the incumbent within the Republican Party, but there isn't this, let me figure out what's going on let me figure out who's going to run, who I should vote for, thinking about what's going on in the other party. And this is just, it's as if every party is its kind of own little world. Okay, so in this kind of world, we do a quantitative analysis. So we have, I should say, kind of painful data set collection effort here. So the parties are, again, not particularly well financed and not particularly well organized, and so they just don't keep records of who ran and who lost. So we created a data set by scraping together all the newspaper articles available from major news sources. We put together biography and career histories, some of it from our past work. Noah Nathan's dissertation involved creating an ethnic name dictionary. So he had a list of politicians and had Ghanaians code the ethnicity of each person in triplicate, so we have a good guess at the ethnicity implied by a particular name, and we use that as a dictionary to code the ethnicity of all of our aspirants. We feel pretty good. We end up, out of the 275 constituencies, 219 remaining in the party that had the reforms. And what this looks like, just, the side that had the reforms is the green, the side that didn't have the reforms is blue, and you can you can see the average is greater. So 3.5 instead of 2.9 people running per race. And you can also see the distribution, right? It's a little bit, fatter on the higher numbers for the green side than the blue side, right? So kind of just the initial cut at the data looks like, it made a difference for the MPP. We use census data to code the ethnicity for the constituencies, and a lot of our theory has come from the fact that we've done a lot of surveys with people who've run for office, and we've been working in Ghana for about 10 years. So, we have talked with people who ran for office, why they didn't run again, what they thought happened, what they knew at the time they decided to run or didn't know. And we use these interviews mostly for the data set to fill in the biographical details, but to just kind of get a sense of what's going on. The technique is matching. For Dan and others who might be super nerdy about this sort of thing, these are the variables that really matter. Crucially for us, we control for, meaning that we want to make sure we're not influenced, our results aren't influenced by a measure of cultural conservatism. We know that in parts of northern Ghana, which are predominantly Muslim, there are more social norms against women participating in public life than in the south. So we control for the population share of Muslims in the constituency. And we're also controlling for whatever the outcome was in the previous primary. So if women ran before, we're controlling for that, because that's already an indicator that the constituency, there were people who thought the constituency was effectively liberal enough to think about a woman. And so what do we get here? Again, we start out with unbalanced data, and we end up with better balance. And here's the key thing. So for this is our key result for thinking about women in politics for Ghana. We get an extra 0.17 woman, extra 1/6 of a woman due to these reforms. But remember, we had 1 in 3 constituencies having 1 woman before, right? Like the average was 0.34 aspirants per constituency before the reform, and our estimate of the effect is 0.17. So it's a 50% bump. We see also that we get 2/5 of an aspirant from non-core ethnic groups. We see a slight decrease, a quarter of a person running from a core ethnic group, and the total number looks like maybe a small bump in the total number of people running. But the composition of the people running has changed. That's what our result is saying. And then, so the other, so let's see. Right, so this is consistent with our story that you change who's voting. We actually have democratization, and we end up with people being encouraged and therefore being willing to stand. It's kind of different from the general story that, actually the places that women have done best are the places that are quite undemocratic. Hypotheses, given those previous results, hypotheses for, who's actually going to be the nominee is, the kind of, most places went from having, no people running to, some women running. So it seems, pretty reasonable to say, you can't go down if you didn't have any women nominees before. So here's a possible, positive effect of the reforms. Maybe it's going to be harder for somebody who is, what our interview called a money bag. It's unclear whether incumbents would have more or less of an advantage. And then, we have fewer people from the core ethnic group running, so maybe it's just less likely they're going to be the nominee. This part is more speculative. There isn't real theory on this portion. And again, a different set of matching variables, same statistical technique. Same issue where we have terrible balance, and we have good balance at the end. This is very brief. I'm happy to talk about this later. And then here are our results. So, this is our 50% effect. We get not quite a tenth of a woman more as a nominee. These are very, very modest effects, but really significant compared with the baseline. And you have to start somewhere is the way we're thinking about this. Do we end up with fewer nominees, people who actually end up as the last two people you might vote for if you're voting in the general election? Fewer of them are from a core ethnic group. But the incumbents seem to do better. So you might think of this kind of, we're democratizing, right? We've gone from very small numbers of people who are really embedded with the party, almost all men, voting, and like the first step of are people running, that looks kind of democratizing, kind of, just broadening. But in the end, we end up with more women. More incumbents. So, this is still consistent with a reduction in vote buying because the people who have only a private sector background but no government experience where they might have developed a reputation for community service or something like this, those people aren't actually more likely to be a nominee. But in general, it's hard for us to say that it's super democratizing with just less than 1/10 of a woman who's more likely to be a nominee. So, what do we think might be behind this? Part of it is actually, of that long list of things that the MP listed, cultural norms and bias was a big factor, and you can see it. Our effect is actually quite substantial in the places where, the proportion of the population that is Muslim is smaller than the median, and it's 0 in the above the median. This is not an effect of the constituency being Muslim because this is correlated with being in the South versus being in the North. And the South just has much more commercial activity. There are probably more people who have businesses. There's just a lot of other things going on. But one suggestive piece of evidence is that it's basically 0. There's a 0 effect in the places that have above median constituency share of Muslims. So for us, we have, we've said we're going to use one party compared to the other party, but you could think there would be lots of other things going on, and this reform, even though I've posed this as potentially a different thing from constitutional reforms or imposing a candidate, something that's consistent with democracy that could increase the number of women, even though I've said this, it could be that there are just other things that are different between the parties, that make it look like the reforms had an effect. The reforms aren't the only thing that's different between the two parties. And so one of these is, maybe one party made a bigger effort to recruit more women. Maybe that's just what's going on. It's just not the reforms. We know that this isn't correct. Both parties made big efforts, including the fee that women have to pay to try to run for office. They give women 50% discounts. They've done lots of other things to try to recruit women, and the effects have generally been stronger in the other party. Another issue is, maybe one party is just much more welcoming of women. They're more democratic. They made those reforms, didn't they? And so maybe it's just a general cultural difference. We think this is unlikely to be true because the reason that the NDC was able to put in the reforms is that because there's not that much democracy. The guy at the top was able to actually just put the rule in place. The other party wasn't able to put the rule in place because they had factions and people were fighting. And so it's, that's not really the explanation here. And maybe it's just, maybe people like to run for particular kinds of parties, depending upon the context. And so maybe there was something about the context that changed that was differentially affecting the two parties. So the big thing here is that people like to run where they're going to win, right? So this is why the Democrats have 20-some people running, right? They think this is their big chance, right? So in this context, the party that adopted the reforms was actually trending downwards. The economy wasn't doing so well. They thought they might lose re-election. And so there was a lot of energy on the other side. So if there are going to be more people jumping in to run for office, it's going to be on the other side rather than the side that had the primary. So that's probably actually not the reason. So just as a, just a piece of social science, it's like process of elimination of all kinds of alternative explanations here. So, other ways in which this could have happened, we're telling the story that it could be that when you change who's voting, you change the kinds of people who feel encouraged about running. So if you're facing a 50-50 electorate, women feel more encouraged. But maybe what's happened here is that the rules have just changed and everybody's uncertain what's going to happen, because you change the rules and who knows, right, kind of situation. But it's unclear why that would have led to our particular pattern of results. Why shouldn't people from the core ethnic groups also run more if they feel like, oh, who knows what could happen, it's maybe my chance. And it could also be that in this kind of chaos, people from the core groups, instead of coalescing around one candidate, they've got a whole bunch of people jumping in. Right, so they're splitting the vote, and you can kind of think about the unpredictability of the Democratic primary right now in this way, right? You can't say there's the progressive faction that's this big, the centrist faction that's this big, and one's bigger than the other, and therefore one side is going to win, because people are jumping in, and they might just divide the vote. So it's just maybe that's what's going on, but again, to have our results, you would just have to have that kind of problem only among the people in the core ethnic group. And we have no reason to think that this is what's going on. And there's no particular evidence that more candidates from that group are jumping in, dividing the vote, right? We just had no positive effect for that group. So, so we think, well, what we've done is actually have pretty good evidence that if you diversify, in this case, the primary electorate, but generally an electorate, you end up with a diversified group of aspirants. And eventually, in this case, a much more diverse group of nominees. The number of women who are actually elected went up a little bit, and we're just not set up to analyze whether the reforms made a difference with the actual number of people up front. But it makes a difference whether you're actually even nominated at all. You can't get elected unless you're nominated. So we think it's a pretty interesting way of thinking about what does extension of the franchise mean? What does changing who votes means in a new democracy? And then, in some ways, this is different from the you should impose women candidates kind of approach, or we should train women to stand up for themselves kind of approach. The two things that people mostly generally say. So we have a reform that a party could do, in a place where it's actually really hard to just create new seats for women. Right? So the single-member district systems, for example. And then, but, money can find another way around these kinds of systems. So this is a short-run effect of one election. The next election hasn't happened yet, but, maybe they find their way around this particular rule. And then does this kind of increasing democracy in a party always mean kind of more democratic outcomes in the sense of more representative of the people voting? Some recent evidence from Kenya and Botswana suggest otherwise, actually, which is really disappointing. These studies by other people haven't studied the representation of women, but generally they find, okay, you get more turnover of people who are nominees when you have these elections, but there are often people who are already really tied to the party leadership who survive. So when there's chaos, it's much easier for the guy at the top to say, you should be the nominee. And everybody's like, oh, okay, because I can't tell the difference between you and all the 10 other people running. So it really gives leadership quite a large role to play. In the Ghanaian case, they stepped back from this at the same time that they did the reform, which might be a really important kind of separate political will kind of condition to letting the primary reforms have their effect on changing who is eventually nominated. So I'm very happy to take lots of questions on any part of this, but thank you very much for your attention and the opportunity to speak about this. Thank you.
Just a reminder, we know that some of you in a few minutes will need to leave, but if you have a question, please come to the microphone so we can be sure to hear the question on the video as well as the answer. Please tell us your name, what you're studying, and we'll go for as long as there are questions.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm Coleman Packer. I'm studying political science here. And I'm just curious about maybe the cultural aspect of, you know, what Ghana is going through. You mentioned that there were matrilineal tribes and, you know, customs that, you know, were progressive, I guess, as compared to like Europe and the global north. And so, you know, considering Ghana's history with British colonialism, how much do you think that patriarchal culture and customs and attitudes were transplanted from, you know, from the colonizers to the Ghanaian culture?
Oh, so there's definitely a significant component of this.
Right.
This idea of, you know, the domestic realm being a woman's realm is a very European idea on this. So you know, and some historians have done really great work establishing this. The kind of preservation of kind of cultural bias is probably actually more to do with some of the economic consequences of this. So it means less education or less opportunity for education if there aren't, you know, as many funds to support all the children. The fact that means that more women are in the informal sector instead of the formal sector. And all of that means you are embedded in a network of women who are all much poorer than kind of the worldly network. And so I would think that probably, rather than kind of a direct impact of that cultural norm, it's probably through these other aspects.
Interesting, okay, fascinating, thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
My name is Nathaniel Nelson. I'm studying mechanical engineering, and you're doing a lot of research in a different country.
Yeah.
And as a lot of us are Americans, what sort of things do we need to know about doing research in another country and sort of learning the things that it's like, oh, this is different, or looking for variables that I wouldn't expect would exist?
Wow, that's a big question. So I think being open to everything being potentially different is a really important thing. So so I think of the first time I went to Africa, and everything was so different that I felt like I had about 2 weeks to kind of note how everything struck me as different before everything became normal, and to be really aware of this. Like I couldn't have. The problem wasn't that I didn't notice that things were different. It was that I noticed that everything was different, and so that was one big aspect of this. The other is, I think, we're often not. I think it's very important to be pretty conscious about whether things are stylistic differences or whether things are kind of core differences. So thinking about this as a Japanese person, when people describe, Japanese culture or Japanese people, I think, there are some things that are kind of quite core in terms of what I think are important or not important. But there are lots of other things that are much more stylistic. So being non-aggressive, I don't think I'm non-aggressive, but some people think Japanese people are less aggressive and so on. So I think kind of being aware that some things might be surface and some things might be more core differences is another way of thinking about the difference.
Hi, my name is Josh Benyon. I'm studying international relations. I'm in Professor Nielsen's international relations capstone class right now. I really liked the hypothesized causal mechanism that you talked about in regards to by expanding the primary, like the size of it in all of its effects on people's views, on representation of women and causing these different things. I guess I was just wondering, does Ghana provide any data on voting trends? Like, were you able to look at at the actual data of who was voting, was there a decrease in voter turnout in response to less money incentives for people to off their vote? Like, were you able to see any of that data, or do they not have it?
So we have spotty records of vote outcomes. So this candidate got so many votes and this candidate got so many votes, but there's no centralized record of it. So
Gotcha.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's very sad. Thank you for the question, though.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Leslie Hadfield in the Africana Studies program and History Department. I am hoping this question is going to be I've been thinking about it as I was coming up here. I'm wondering about exceptions or exceptional women who
Yeah.
end up running, and how that might fit into this. And I was thinking about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf,
Yeah.
and how in some ways she was very exceptional, but then it really was a lot of the women who on the ground gave her the support she needed to be elected. Even without that, she might not have made it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm just wondering if how much that might play into this, the numbers of people who are voting and who the candidates are, the nominees are, how exceptional are they? Is there
Yeah.
a correlation that you can track? I don't know.
No, so for, I think, what we do have is some biographical information on the people who ran, and by general Ghanaian population standards, the women who run are indeed exceptional, right? They run companies, they are, they're just very prominent in leadership, in public life, and that is not most people. The kind of dynamic of, that they weren't running before. They were there before, they weren't running. And so what is the additional component that makes them feel like, okay, they have a chance, is that what they're trying to do is not do this vote buying amongst the old boys network, but trying to draw in regular women, visiting market associations and so on, and getting them to turn out to vote, and making this claim and making this argument that I understand, your needs particularly, because I am also a woman. And so in the sense of, ordinary women being part of the phenomenon that helps put these very exceptional women into public life, I think it sounds very similar.
Okay, and do you think, just a quick follow-up,
Yeah.
do you think that if this continued, that then it would open up more opportunities for ordinary women to be nominated? Or?
So one of the things that the parties have been trying to do is to get more women involved at the local level. So to get them to run for one of those 5 offices, or to just become more regular attendees at the regular party membership level. Those are the people who get to vote now. So they've been doing, making efforts to get women in, because in the end, they're the people who go out and campaign with other women. So some of those people might funnel up, though the kind of, you have to come from wealth, you have to have made some money to step into politics at a high level, is probably still going to be a barrier for quite a while. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. I'm studying communication disorders, so totally not related, but I'm just curious, kind of related to her question. I know that we've seen these changes, like with these, with the changes that they made. So kind of related, do you expect that to continue to grow and continue to change, or are there going to have to be more reforms made, or like big changes? Does that make sense?
So I think it's, so one thing is that the primary system has changed, almost every election for the party that actually adopted this, because they look at what happened, they didn't get the kinds of people they wanted, and they're going to try something else again. For this election, this coming one, it's stable, so we'll get a chance to see whether there's a continuation. But I think it's actually, the real constraint, I think, for a lot of people is that it's very expensive to get into politics, and that's probably going to require something else to kind of have larger changes. Like, this is only going to affect, so this is like people who have resources, who maybe didn't feel encouraged, but to expand out of the already resourced further out is going to be a harder push without something else.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Please join me in thanking.
interesting. Than